start with a simple fact most people never stop to think about. The United States, as it exists today, its language, its government, its borders, its entire founding story, sits downstream of one voyage that almost didn't happen. 3 small ships, a captain nobody in Spain's royal court fully trusted, and a plan based on math that turned out to be wrong. If that voyage fails, the chain of events that eventually produces the country called America doesn't just change a little. It may never produce anything called America at all. Here's what actually happened. In 1492, an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus convinced the Spanish crown to fund a westward voyage to Asia based on a calculation of the Earth's size that most educated people at the time already knew was too small. He wasn't trying to prove the world was round. That was already settled science. He was trying to find a shorter trade route to the spice markets of Asia, and his math simply happened to place a very large, very unexpected landmass directly in the way. The voyage itself came far closer to failing than most people realize. By early October, more than a month after leaving the Canary Islands, Columbus's crew had seen nothing but open ocean for weeks. Rations were running low, morale was worse, and multiple accounts described the crew growing close to open mutiny, some pushing to turn the ships around and sail home before they ran out of food entirely. Columbus reportedly struck a deal to buy a few more days. If land wasn't sighted soon, they would turn back. Land appeared just in time to hold that promise together. On October 12th that year, lookouts on the ship Pinta spotted land, an island in what's now the Bahamas. Columbus never realized his mistake. He died still believing he'd reached the outer islands of Asia. But the door he opened, whether he understood what was on the other side of it or not, didn't close again. What followed reshaped 2 entire hemispheres, and not gently. Within a few decades, Spanish expeditions moved through the Caribbean and into Central and South America, extracting enormous wealth, especially silver, pulled out of mountains like Potosi in what's now Bolivia, in quantities that flooded European economies and helped fund empires, wars, and the earliest global trade networks. That wealth is part of what financed the naval and economic power that let other European nations, England, France, the Netherlands, follow the same path west soon after. Alongside the wealth came something historians now call the Columbian Exchange, an enormous, largely unplanned transfer of crops, animals, and diseases between 2 hemispheres that had been biologically separate for over 10,000 years. Corn, potatoes, and tomatoes moved east, eventually transforming diets and populations across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Horses, wheat, and sugarcane moved west, permanently reshaping how indigenous nations farmed, traveled, and fought. It's one of the largest ecological events in human history, and almost none of it was intentional. It was simply what happens when 2 long-separated worlds suddenly touch again. The human cost of that contact is almost impossible to overstate. Diseases that had never existed in the Americas before, smallpox most devastating among them, swept through indigenous populations who had no immunity to them at all. Entire civilizations that had thrived for centuries, including the Taíno communities Columbus encountered first, and later the Aztec and Inca empires further south, were devastated by disease, often before a single Spanish soldier arrived in their territory, since epidemics frequently outran the explorers carrying them. Historians estimate that within a century of first contact, somewhere between 70% and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas had died, largely from disease rather than direct violence, though violence, forced labor systems like the encomienda, and displacement compounded the devastation on top of it. Entire nations, languages, and systems of government were wiped out or permanently broken
before most of them ever fought a single sustained war against a European army.
Now follow the thread specifically toward what became the United States. Spain's early foothold in the Caribbean and Central America gave European powers a working blueprint: how to establish a colony, how to extract resources, how to manage or mismanage relations with indigenous nations. England arrived later, working from lessons Spain had already learned, first at Roanoke, then more successfully at Jamestown in 1607, followed by Plymouth in 1620. Those English colonies grew, multiplied along the Atlantic coast, and eventually numbered 13. The same 13 that, more than a century and a half after Columbus first landed, would declare independence and become the United States. Everything about that founding traces back through that chain. The language spoken in the new nation's founding documents is English because England colonized that particular stretch of coastline. The legal system borrows heavily from English common law for the same reason. The layout of colonies, the relationship between colonial governments and the Crown, even the specific grievances that led to revolution, all sit downstream of exactly which European power arrived when and under what conditions Columbus's voyage had already established. Even the specific brutal institution of race-based slavery that took root in the English colonies followed a particular economic and legal template that developed over generations, shaped heavily by patterns Spain and Portugal had already established further south. It's worth noticing how much of the map itself still carries Spain's fingerprints, even in the parts of America that became English rather than Spanish. Florida, Colorado, Nevada, Montana. Entire states carry Spanish names today because Spanish expeditions mapped and claimed huge stretches of what's now the American South and West, long before English colonists ever arrived on the Atlantic coast. The United States that eventually formed wasn't purely an English project laid onto empty land. It expanded, centuries later, directly into territory Spain had already shaped, named, and partially settled. So that's what happened. Now, otherwise. Picture that same October morning in 1492, except this time, the lookout on the Pinta sees nothing but open water. Maybe Columbus's calculations are corrected before departure. Maybe a storm turns the ships back early. Maybe the Spanish crown, still recovering from the costly war that had just ended in Granada, decides the funding isn't worth the risk after all, and the voyage is quietly shelved. Here's the uncomfortable complication, though, and it's worth being honest about it up front. European contact with the Americas doesn't necessarily disappear just because this specific voyage does. 500 years before Columbus, Norse sailors led by Leif Erikson had already reached the coast of what's now Newfoundland, establishing a short-lived settlement that didn't last, largely because it was too isolated and too far from the economic and political engines back home to be sustained. By the late 1400s, though, the situation is different. Portugal is already pushing deep into Atlantic exploration. English-funded expeditions, like John Cabot's voyage in 1497, are already being planned and financed within just a few years of Columbus's actual landing. The economic and technological conditions of that specific decade in Europe, better ships, better navigation, intense competition between rival crowns for new trade routes, made some kind of sustained transatlantic contact very likely within a few decades either way. But likely eventually, and exactly the same, are very different outcomes, and the gap between them is where an entirely different United States, or no United States at all, becomes possible. If Spain isn't first, the head start shifts to whoever is. Push that timeline out even 1 or 2 additional decades, and Portugal, already deeply invested in African and Asian trade routes, or England itself, fresh off Cabot's early voyage,
could plausibly become the first major colonial power to establish a lasting foothold in the Americas. That single shift changes almost everything downstream of it. Spanish silver never floods European markets on the same schedule, which means the empires and wars that silver financed play out differently, which means the balance of power between European nations heading into the age of colonization looks nothing like the one we actually got.
Follow that further into the specific patch of coastline that becomes the United States. If England arrives without the benefit of a Spanish blueprint to learn from, colonies like Jamestown may struggle even harder in their brutal early years, when starvation and conflict with Powhatan communities already nearly ended the English foothold before it began in our actual history. Delay or weaken that first successful English colony, and the entire timeline of settlement along the Atlantic coast shifts. Maybe France, already established through fur trade routes along the St. Lawrence River in this alternate timeline, expands further south and claims a much larger share of what becomes the eastern seaboard. Maybe Dutch trading colonies, instead of being squeezed into a small foothold around what becomes New York, grow into something far larger and more permanent. Push that difference all the way to the 1770s, and the entire premise of a unified 13-colony revolution starts to wobble. A patchwork of French, Dutch, and smaller English territories doesn't necessarily share the same language, the same legal traditions, or the same specific grievances against a single distant crown that made the actual American Revolution possible. There may be no single, coherent 13 colonies moment at all. Instead, a fractured set of separate colonial territories, each with different founding languages and different relationships to different European powers, each potentially declaring independence separately, on separate timelines, if they declare it at all. Even the map itself would likely look unrecognizable. Without Spain's early head start across the south and west, there's no guarantee any single European power ends up claiming, naming, and shaping that much of the continent the way Spain actually did. States that carry Spanish names today might carry French or Dutch names instead, or might belong to entirely different political entities by the time any kind of American independence movement forms, assuming a single unified country ever forms across that much territory at all, rather than several smaller nations divided along old colonial boundaries that never got absorbed into one country, the way they eventually were in our timeline. That fracture matters for something even bigger than a name on a map. The specific philosophical framework baked into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, Enlightenment ideas about natural rights, representative government, and checks on centralized power, reached the American colonies specifically through English and broader Western European intellectual traditions of that particular era. A different colonizing power, arriving under different political and religious circumstances, could easily produce a founding philosophy that looks nothing like the one written in Philadelphia in 1776. Maybe there's a United States in name eventually, decades or centuries later, but built on entirely different legal and political foundations. Or maybe what emerges instead is several smaller, separate nations, each shaped by whichever European power got there first and stayed longest. Even the darker threads of that history shift shape rather than disappear. The specific legal and economic system of race-based chattel slavery that took hold in the English colonies developed the way it did, partly because of the particular labor shortages, crops, and legal precedents England inherited from watching Spain and Portugal operate for a full century beforehand. A different colonizing timeline doesn't erase the underlying economic pressure that made forced labor so profitable in plantation agriculture. But it could easily change which nations imported enslaved labor first, on what legal terms, and how long the institution lasted before abolition movements gained enough power to challenge it.
And here's the detail that changes the emotional weight of the entire question. In this otherwise version of history, the indigenous nations of North America aren't given a reprieve for free. The diseases that devastated their populations in our actual timeline weren't primarily a Spanish problem or an English problem. They were a biological reality of two populations that had been separated for over 10,000 years, suddenly making contact again. Some version of that demographic catastrophe likely still happens, regardless of which European flag arrives first, simply because the immunological gap between the two hemispheres was going to collide with someone eventually. But the timeline, the specific communities affected first, and the political consequences of which nations survived long enough to negotiate, resist, or adapt on their own terms, could look dramatically different depending on exactly how fast and by whom that contact actually unfolds.
So maybe the real answer here isn't that the United States simply doesn't exist without Columbus. It's that almost every specific detail that makes the United States exactly what it is, its language, its founding documents, its borders, even the timeline of tragedy for the nations who were already here, was riding on outcomes far more fragile and far more coincidental than the story usually gets credit for. Change one captain's math, one storm, one funding decision by one increasingly cautious royal court, and the entire chain reaction that produced a specific country called America, speaking a specific language, founded on a specific set of ideas, may never have assembled itself in quite the same order again. It's a strange thing to sit with, how much of a nation's entire identity can trace back to a handful of decisions made by people who never once considered that an entire country, centuries later, would exist because of exactly how those decisions landed. If a single funding decision at one royal court could end up determining which language, which legal system, and which founding philosophy an entire continent eventually inherited, it raises an even bigger question worth sitting with. How many other inevitable nations we take for granted today were actually built on outcomes just as fragile, just as dependent on one specific decision going one specific way at exactly the right moment for it to stick? That's exactly where we're headed next time on Otherwise, into the empires and nations that almost never existed at all. Subscribe and find out how thin that thread really was.